that you can see
Okay.
where the funds are being directed.
It would be nice to see trends in parking, police, red light, you know, breakout as you can, so we can watch trends and see whether performance is satisfactory or not.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I could just add, parking revenue does not go through the POA. That goes separate through the parking department. It's not dealt with in the POA at all. And when you ask for police revenues, there's some 40 enforcement agencies that file within our jurisdiction. So when I give you the revenue, I can give the red light revenue numbers separately because it's journaled to the traffic department. But when I give you the amount of revenue for POA, it'll be all enforcement agencies combined. I can't pull out.
We have 40 enforcement agencies in Hamilton?
Yes. When you count Minister of Labour, Minister of Natural Resources, Animal Control.
We don't get the revenue from Minister of Labour, do we?
In some cases, we do. There are some fines that are dedicated to the province, and I have a list of those. I could identify those for you. Something like occupational health and safety. The city gets the revenue, but WSIB, they do not. But those charges still get filed through the POA.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Sensing from my council colleagues around me have the same angst as I am. We like to see who are the enforcement agencies. I think police would be a big one. I think parking would be a big one. The past 7 years, watch trends. You know, I'm particularly interested in police being chair of that. I'd appreciate that. If you need a motion, like a motion, or can you take that as direction?
So through the chair, we can receive it as direction. We'll work with POA staff to try to identify the various agencies and the revenue streams as well. We can engage parking in terms of the trends around parking. I know that information was made available in a report some months ago, but we can follow up with parking.
Okay, so it'll be easy to get if you already had it in a report then. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Wonderful, thanks. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And very briefly on the write-offs and outstanding accounts receivable, can I get an understanding about the trends in that area? So from 09 to 2016, accounts receivable year-end prior to write-off requests have gone, they're almost up 30% over that time. And so how do we account for that? I'm looking at the write-offs on Appendix A, page 6 or 7. Wendy, if you could just advise on that first one there, it says files. Part of it says includes parking and then no parking. 1 year we have 0. So it's a difficult one to understand because the numbers are really all over the map.
Chair. Parking at one time was filed through the provincial offenses, and policy and procedure changes, legislation changed, so now it's not through the court system. That's why that designation is there. And I apologize. Could you repeat the rest of your questions?
Sorry, so that policy change or procedure change would have happened between 211 and 212?
I'd have to get the exact date, but I believe so.
Okay. And then for the year 215 under files, there are 0 listed in 215.
We did not do a write-off in 2015 because of there was a timing change with how the Ministry of the Attorney General was handling the write-offs. So for it to make it easier for us to reconcile between when we get council approval and when we finally get them written off out of the ICON system, we did not do a write-off last year.
Okay. My other question is related to the last column where it says, if you look in 209, the amount's 42 million, and then 216, it's 61 million. Is that a reflection of the fees going up, or is it the volume? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Sharon, can you tell me, I'm sorry, where you're...
The last column in that write-off history chart on page 6 to 7. Across.
That is the outstanding accounts receivables in the Provincial Offences Office, and I don't know if you will recall that there's been many articles written across the province at the alarming rate that they're increasing not only in the City of Hamilton but across the province. and the ministry is trying to work with the Municipal Court Managers Association as well as AMAFRA in coming up with methods that will assist us in better collection. And one of those would be, I believe it's Bill 34, where they are going to, for cases that meet the criteria, you're going to be able to not only suspend their driver's license, but deny them access to their sticker for their vehicle at the same time. The problem with the license suspension is an officer doesn't know they're under suspended unless they're pulled over for some reason. But that sticker's in their eyesight, and they'll get pulled over and hopefully collect the revenue.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Further questions or comments? Seeing none, please have a motion to receive item 5.2. Councillor Pearson, Councillor Vanderbeek, all in favor? Thank you. 5.3, follow-up performance audit report 2013-15, checks. Are there any questions or discussion with respect to 5.3? Seeing none, may I please have a motion to receive 5.3. Councillor Pearson and Councillor Skelly, all in favor? Thank you. 5.4, tax appeals under sections 357 and 358 of the Municipal Act. Are there questions or discussion with respect to 5.4? Moved by Councillor Collins and seconded by Councillor Pearson, all in favor? 5.5, that is carried. 5.5, Treasurer's Investment Report 2015 fiscal year by Aon Hewitt. Are there questions or discussion with respect to 5.5? Seeing none. Moved by Councillor Johnson and seconded by Councillor Skelly, all in favor? Thanks. 6.1, delegation by Stephen Aquino respecting item 8.3, request to ban due to non-adherence to fair wage policy and fair wage schedule.
Through the chair, I may.
Yeah.
We'll decided to move that.
That is correct.
Deal with that at 8.3.
Yeah, pardon me, I just sort of blindly went ahead with my script. So we'll save that bit of text. We'll move on to item 1, proposed write-offs of outstanding fines for provincial offences. Are there questions or discussion with respect to item 8.1? Moved by Councillor Johnson and seconded by Councillor Pearson, all in favor. 8.2, policy for business travel, seminars, and conferences. Amendments. Are there questions or discussion with respect to 8.2? Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I wonder if staff would just direct me to what the changes were. I was hoping I'd see them highlighted or underlined or something. Just what's been tweaked?
Through the chair, actually Bev Neal, our author, has given me a cheat sheet of the changes, so I can read them to you and then send them off to the committee members. In terms of some of the changes as it relates to authorization outside of Ontario within Canada, the authorization would be shifted to the general manager or director. Outside Canada, right now is the city manager, and that would change to city manager and or designate, including general managers. The per diems within Canada would change from $71 to $75. And as it relates to U.S. per diems, it would change from $100 Canadian to $100 U.S. And there has been some impacts as it relates to the change in the Canadian dollar currency. In terms of reporting will continue, and as it relates to, for instance, conference findings reports, and those will reside within the departments. So any individual attending a conference is required to prepare a report after the conference, summarizing the findings of the conference, and again, those reports will reside within the departments. In terms of a new amendment to the policy is an option for a lower per diem for incidentals, and what would be required for that option is receipts for meals required. So again, in the situation where the per diem, the attendee is only attending a portion of a day, is it allows for a lower per diem supported by receipts and documentation. So those are is a summary of the changes in the policy.
Thank you very much. Other questions or discussion with respect to 8.2? Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Skelly. All in favor? Thanks. 8.3, request to ban due to non-adherence to fair wage policy and fair wage schedule. Now, this is the appropriate moment for me to invite Stephen Aquino to come forward to speak to 8.3. Please, Mr. Aquino.
Good morning, and I'd like to thank the members of the Audit, Finance and Administration Committee for allowing me to speak today. My name is Steve Aquino. I am Vice President of Bondfield Construction. It's a family-owned business. We are one of Canada's 10 largest general contractors, which is significant in that we're not a national company. Our revenues are solely based in Ontario. We've done a considerable amount of work over the history of our company in the Hamilton area. That includes buildings at McMaster, where we're currently at, high school and elementary schools, libraries, the Westmount Community Centre, which was one of these projects that we're here to discuss today. We also do a significant amount of water and wastewater treatment work, and recently completed a project at the Woodward facility for the city. We also are solar and renewable energy contractors, and we're involved in the project in Haldimand County, which is not far from the city. As a company, we are signatory to the Carpenters Union, and thus a strong potential partner on any future infrastructure project that the city intends to tender. We directly employ over 1,000 skilled trade workers across the province, many of whom live in Hamilton and the surrounding areas. This includes unionized carpenters, laborers, operating engineers, painters, masons, rod workers, and pipe layers. Bondfield and its subsidiary companies were not found to be directly in contravention of the fair wage policy. We're a general contractor. We're here to discuss today issues that subcontractors that were performing work for us and their actions or inaction. On the two projects that we were undertaken for the City of Hamilton, one was the Westmount Community Centre, the other was the Waterdown Library. PHE contractors, Neckerson contractors, and Avon Electric were found to have contravened the policy. All of these contractors, which I think is very important for the committee to realize, have completed other work for the city, for other general contractors, and even though they were found guilty of their actions, they will continue to be able to work on your sites whether or not you decide to ban Bondfield today. And I think that is the real crux of our issue with what you're proposing today. And I feel that our company met our obligations under the Act because we ensured that it was an element and a tenet of our subcontracts with these companies that they follow the fair wage policy. It was clearly in the contracts. We provided those contracts to city staff. We advertised and displayed the fair wage policy at all of our sites, adjacent to the safety materials that every worker that goes on the site is expected to review. So we let the workers know what their rights with respect to the fair wage policies were. Then, when we were notified by the city that there was a complaint, we acted immediately to ensure that the subcontractors cooperated with the audit process, that they paid the necessary restitution to their employees and demonstrated that to city staff, and then we were ensured that the city was reimbursed for all the costs that they incurred. Nevertheless, after these issues arose, the city put a penalty on Bondfield and advised us that in order to remain on the bidding list, that we needed to audit 3 projects that we completed with that we had with the city. And we attempted to do so because we want to work for the City of Hamilton. This was not something that we take flippantly. This is a major issue. That's why, as one of the owners of the business, I'm here today to speak to you. Our penalty was you wanted an audit done of all of the subcontractors' employee payroll records of the 3 projects that we did for any subtrade that has work that's pertinent to the fair wage policy. That may entail up to 30 companies on a building of the complexity, say, of a city hall or a community center. So initially what we did, we began to audit the work that we did at the Woodward treatment facility, and we provided city staff a letter from a registered third-party accounting firm that they stated that they reviewed the subcontractor's payroll records, and they advised that they were in compliance with the fair wage policy. So it was a one-page letter, and that was rejected by city staff because that audit was not completed by Bondfield. So we were told that we had to undertake the audit. So we retained Deloitte, which, if you're not familiar with, is a large accounting firm. And we initiated the process with Deloitte to deal with city staff directly as to how do we go about generating a process to do this. And unfortunately, I don't believe a report has ever been done in this manner, that you've asked a general contractor to go and audit someone and to do this. There was no resource for us to follow. We tried to develop something that would appease city staff. And we prepared an accounting proposal that came from Deloitte as to how they wanted to go into these companies and do this work. You have to understand, although we're contractually bound to these companies, you're knocking on the door and asking somebody to be allowed to look at sensitive financial records, and they're not obligated to give us every single record they have. We tried, and I want the committee to understand that we tried. This proposal went back and forth, and the final recommendation from city staff was that no, we're not going to allow you to do an audit, which typically in an audit process you will test records from different months or different payroll periods. It was every employee, every payroll period, the entire duration of the project. And we had till last October to get that done. It was an impossible undertaking. Unfortunately, I will admit that I told Deloitte to stand down, that we wouldn't be able to accomplish that, what we were being asked to do. That it just was too much, and you've said, we'll let you keep bidding if you do this, but this was an impossible activity to accomplish. Again, I'm asking for the committee's thoughts on this, that you're punishing the general contractor for the action of these particular subtrades, that maybe the city should consider pre-qualifying the major subtrades like mechanical and electrical contractors that have done work for you before, that you're confident will do the work the way it needs to be done, and then if they contravene the act, they get booted off your bidders list. By banning Bondfield today, our company will continue. We'll be lesser of a company by not being able to bid Hamilton work. I'm being honest. It's not good for us. We want to work for the City of Hamilton. We're working for the school boards, and we're working for the universities. We want to work for you. We work for Infrastructure Ontario. We're at Joseph Brant Hospital. I believe that we're the type of company that you want bidding your work. We provide competition. We provide other prices. When we're pricing, that has an impact on the other bidders to ensure that the city gets the best value for their tenders, which just benefits the city and benefits the taxpayers. So again, I feel that the process, and in terms of the expectations with this process on how you can ask a general contractor, other than to make it a contractual requirement, other than to advertise the rights of the fair wage policy to the workers, how we can ensure that these companies are paying people every pay period what they're supposed to. We're not in those businesses. We're not signing those checks. And to tell us today that we're no longer allowed to work for you for the next period of time, I don't think that's going to resolve this. And again, just in closing, if you want industry input, we would be more than happy to work with your city staff to go on a committee to try and develop procedures to ensure that the policy is followed and that companies that are trying to follow it aren't getting banned from that. I just thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aquino. Just before you leave the podium, could you remain just for a moment, please? Questions for Mr. Aquino. And I saw Councillor Skelly indicate, and then I have Councillor Ferguson.
Mr. Aquino, can you explain to me how you monitor currently and how subcontractors to ensure that they are meeting the fair wage contract, and how has it changed since the initial filed?
Well, what we would do after we submit a tender and we're notified by the city that we are the preferred proponent or given a letter of intent, we enter into a negotiation phase with all the subcontractors to ensure that they're going to do everything they tell us that they're going to do that's in their quotation. At that point in time, we're specifically outlined that, no, you do not have to be unionized per se for this portion of the work, but you do have to comply with the fair wage policy. And we direct them to your website, we direct them to where it is. So that then when they get a purchase order or a contract from our company, it specifically states within there that all work will be done in accordance with the fair wage policy. At that point in time, then we go through that process. We do an orientation for every worker that comes onto the site. They get a safety orientation where they're told, where the washrooms are, where to go in case of an emergency, what are the dangers on this site. At that point in time, at the end of your orientation, then you'll be instructed, this is the fair wage policy. You have a right to be paid in accordance with these guidelines on this project. And they'll be pointed to the policy, and then they will sign that they have been orientated that day and they're free to go work on the site. So that is our policy to ensure that every worker on the site understands.
The Chair, when was it brought to your attention that these workers were not being paid according to this policy?
Again, it's been a few years. We've completed the Westmount project has been completed for almost, I believe you've occupied it for almost 2 years, so it would be beyond that. And the reason we're here today is because, again, we were notified that we were found to be in non-compliance and that then there was going to be this probation period where we were expected to do the audits. So then what we did was we waited until we were completed the Woodward project and the Waterdown project to try to commence the audits in order to satisfy the penalties that we were put on. So we've been notified, I think the Westmount would have been over 2 years ago, and the issue with the electrical contractor at Waterdown would have been about a year ago, and we just haven't been successful in any future work with City to have it happen any sooner.
The Chair, to clarify, you were not notified while the project was being built?
We were notified while the project was being built. So Westmount has been complete for 2 years, so it would have been between 2 and 3 years where we were notified during construction, and that's when we notified the subcontractors. There was an audit done of those 2 contractors on the Westmount facility. They were found to be in non-compliance. We had to ensure that the individual workers were paid and then provided check stubs and certifications that we provided the city staff, and then the city took their auditing costs and they forwarded them to us, and we reimbursed the city for those auditing costs that they undertook to review those companies' records.
To the Chair, in terms of a timeline, you're notified the project is still under construction, the subcontractors then comply, and the workers are not out of pocket?
They were reimbursed.
Immediately?
Yes, immediately.
And while the project is being built?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Ferguson?
Well, thank you, Stephen. And my first question to you, I guess you would understand that the general contractor, being Bondfield in this case, is the only people we have contractual relationships with. We have no contractual relationship with the subcontractors. And as being an experienced general contractor, you would cascade those terms and conditions in the prime contract into the subcontract. So we can't turn to your subs. We have to turn to you. I think you understand that part. You mentioned at the start of your presentation that you're signatory to the carpenters agreement. Are you signatory to the others also, like laborers or?
Yes. Yes, Bondfield is signatory to the laborers, the operating engineers, rod workers, painters. I believe it's 6 collective agreements that we are signatory.
And don't those collective agreements have subcontract clauses that would self-discipline this for you, if you will? Because if your subcontractors are unionized, they have to comply with the collective agreement, otherwise it'd be grievances from unions. So were these people who were your subs that were non-compliant, were they signatory to collective agreements?
No, I believe they are signatory to collective agreements, but of the CLAC unions, which is a different organization than, say, the IBEW or the mechanical trades. These contractors specifically, 2 of them are electrical contractors, and the other is a mechanical contractor that were found to be in non-compliance. And Bondfield does not have a unionized agreement or a relationship with those unions, so we were able to subcontract to these contractors.
And that's permitted with all your other non-CLAC contracts to use CLAC subcontractors for areas where you're not in contract relations with?
We do.
All right. And did the same subcontractor violate the fair wage schedule on both projects, Westmount and Waterdown?
No, they were different contractors. So on the Westmount project, it was Neckerson Contractors and PHE, and then at the Waterdown project, it was Avon Electric. So it was different contractors each time, but the same process. We were notified of a complaint, that individual company was audited, the workers were made whole, the city was reimbursed for their time spent in the activity, and then, now we're here today because we're being told you don't.
Do you post the fair wage schedule in the lunchrooms?
I do. We do. We post it adjacent to the safety board so that it's something that they're expected to review every day.
And then, so I assume somebody looked at that fair wage schedule, saw they weren't getting paid that, then filed a complaint with
And
the city?
file a complaint with the city,
Or was
yes.
there a union that filed the complaint with the city?
We're not notified as to how the complaints are generated or how, so I couldn't answer that question.
Okay, my last question, if you're the 10th largest contractor, general contractor in the country, and you only work in Ontario, you obviously swing a pretty big stick with the subcontractors that want to get work from you. I'm puzzled why they wouldn't support your request, because you could do the same thing as the city trying to threaten to ban them from taking you many prices from them unless they allow this audit. Revenue Canada auditors go in all the time to companies and refuse to go in and allow Revenue Canada auditors in. There's pretty serious consequences. You could impose those same consequences on your subcontractors if they won't let Deloitte go in and take a look at the projects. And all they want to look at are the projects where they subcontracted to you, not anybody else. Why wouldn't you force that on them when your bidding rights are at risk?
We tried and we started. You have to understand that some of these records are 3 to 4 years old and they're not available. And secondly, you're asking Deloitte to put their name behind a document that says they reviewed every single hour of every employee that worked on that site, which they can't do because they're only at the mercy of the documentation that's provided to them. So there was questions as to the accuracy and what they could stand behind because they're basically auditing information that's provided to them. So if that subcontractor showed them 4 payroll periods and said 4 people worked there on that site, that's all that Deloitte could audit. But do they know if it was 5 people or 3.5? They don't know who worked on those days at that times. And again, these records are old. So it was a massive undertaking, and I don't believe that it was a fair ask based on standard accounting practices.
Deloitte's through you, Mr. Chairman, Deloitte's a very resourceful accounting firm, one of the big 4. And it seems to me, if they're going in, the first thing I would ask you, which everybody's required to do, is keep Revenue Canada information for 7 years. There'd be source deductions that they're doing, whether it's UIC, CPP, income tax, as a starting point. Remittance to Revenue Canada that would come off that project, which they're required by law to keep for 7 years. I'd love to ask Deloitte why they couldn't do that. It seems like a reasonable request, particularly within a relation, and because they want to keep working for you, being the 10th largest contractor, do you think they'd be quick to respond and accommodate you?
I just have 2 comments on that point, and it is a good point, but again, it doesn't matter because they can work for every other general in the province as well. So if we're tendering the project or we're not, they're still able to bid. So there's no penalty from that standpoint. And secondly, what you're failing to look at is that, yes, they could go through the Revenue Canada files and review that for those contractors, but this is job specific. And those documents just show all of the remittance, and you wouldn't know if those records were for that particular project or not. And secondly, what also we found is that some of these contractors had set up subcontracting relationships as well on top of that. So these people that that were working on the site were not actually employees of those companies, but were subcontractors. So this is part of a bigger problem that you are scratching the surface on. I'm glad you're asking these questions, but that's the difficulty. And you're asking us to audit every person every hour. And now you're getting into subcontract agreements. So it's quite challenging to try to figure out what pertains to the City of Hamilton project over this particular time period.
But every contractor would have a job number that would connect to that particular project, and I won't drill down with you anymore on that. I guess my last question, Mr. Eric, second time I've said that, but my last question to you now is, we employ a lot of general contractors in the City of Hamilton. Nobody else has had this problem. Why? And they probably use the same electrical contractors that got caught with.
Again, I can't answer that question other than the fact that we are one of the 10th biggest general contractors in Canada, and it's probably going to mean that if you're going to go after one guy, you're probably going to go after the biggest guy. And you guys have significant infrastructure work that's coming down the pipeline that forces in this world don't want to see Bondfield bidding if it means that portions of that work will not be done by them. And I can't say why, but maybe you have general contractors that if they're getting the small jobs, well, that's not such a big deal. But wait a minute, we were one of the unsuccessful proponents on the Ivor Wynn project and the velodrome. And that's significant infrastructure. The city has enormous plans for their water and wastewater treatment facilities that involve hundreds of millions of dollars of construction. So if you're going to get one guy off the bidders list, you want to get the guy that is potentially going to be bidding on those projects and maybe not giving you the scope of work that you want to get.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Johnson.
Yep, thank you, and thank you for coming today, Mr. Aquino. I'm asking for process. I try to learn through these scenarios. So I thought I heard you say that at the Woodward Avenue wastewater treatment plant, restitution was paid, city was satisfied, and so that's why the complaint was withdrawn. I'm sure you saw this chart as well.
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't at, it was at the community center and at the library that we had the complaints. We didn't actually have a complaint at Woodward that I've been notified of.
Okay, so thanks for that. So in 2012, a complaint was done, and I'm looking at the value of fair wage shortfall was almost $72,000. Was this restitution paid? Was this all, the city satisfied that it was all done?
Yes, we were provided check stubs that were made to the workers, to the individual workers, and we provided copies of all of those check stubs to the city staff, and then we compensated the city directly for the audit costs.
Okay, and that's the same with the Waterdown Library?
Yes.
Okay, so as far as you're concerned, your fair wage policy was met. You sent in all the proof that it was met in that respect, but through paychecks and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so right now the complaint is still outstanding, where the other one was withdrawn.
My understanding is that we have satisfied the city's requirements with respect to those three specific issues. 3 different companies were found to be in non-compliance, and the workers were compensated each time. The city was reimbursed each time for their costs, and the issues were closed from a fair wage standpoint. But because, as a general contractor, this has happened to us on 3 separate occasions,
okay,
you guys want to say, you know what, we don't want you bidding on any future work of the cities.
Okay, so
yeah, each issue was closed, but because we've had 3 issues, regardless of what they were dealt with, because you've had 3 issues, we want to put you into this probation penalty period. We want you to audit every single company that could potentially have done work at your site to ensure they were in compliance. And it was when we went through that process that we were not able to meet the city's demands.
okay, thank you for that. And the last question I have, and it's really more of a business sense question. You've been through this process at least 3 times. Are you doing, and maybe this is to coattail on a previous question, are you doing anything different now to hopefully this won't happen again? What can you do to ensure that this is not going to happen again?
As I tried to explain, I think that what we've done, because different cities, London, Toronto, there's other large jurisdictions that do have these policies, so we are sensitive to them. And what we try to do is, upon notification that we are the successful proponent, before we give someone a contract, we tell them, make sure you understand the requirements of the fair wage. It's not just dollars in, there's benefit requirements, there's a whole,
But there's no
package.
contract signed.
There's no contract signed at that point. So they get the opportunity to go back and double check, review the policy, and then they enter into a contract with us where it says, you will be in compliance with this plan. And then the workers, when they come to the site, are orientated, and that's where we show them, guys, girls, that's where the plan is. That's the policy. You are to be paid in accordance with that policy. You're free to look at it any time. It stays there through the course of construction.
You signed a contract with the city saying that this is what we promised to do. Then you turn to your subcontractors and they sign the contract to say they promise to follow along the same lines.
Yes.
So the disconnect is?
They try to pull a fast one. They tried to pull a fast one and they got caught.
Okay. Thank you for your answers.
Oh, thank you very much. Councillor Skelly for second time.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Aquino, has your company ever been found non-compliant in any other projects across Ontario?
Never.
Do you, through the Chair, the discrepancy, I believe, is about $70,000 on one project, $66,000 on another. Do you have any idea what that meant to the average worker in terms of what they were being paid on perhaps an hourly rate compared to what they should have been paid?
I don't have that kind of information. I do know that this was not one worker. So it was probably, I believe the crew sizes at the time were, there was 5 or 6 individuals over a year time frame. So off the top of my, just back of the envelope, 50 weeks a year times 40 hours is 2,000 hours a week. If you divide the 70,000 by 8, you're looking at it was a couple $1,000s a year to each worker. That's $3 or $4 that they were being shortchanged of, that they needed to be made whole on.
Through the Chair, did the bidding process flag anything? In other words, did they come in significantly lower than the competition, enough so that it may have raised some flags as to what they were paying their workers?
I would say no. At the time of bidding, there was not a big discrepancy between these subcontractors and the other quotations within the market that we saw. Nothing that would have led us to believe that there was an issue with their plan, that they were, going into the project thinking that we're going to contravene the Fair Wage Act and we're going to, not pay the workers and that's how we're going to be successful. There was nothing that we were provided at the time of tender that would have indicated to us that that was an issue. And I believe if you go through the audits that the city did, a lot of this was with respect to benefits that they were not providing their workers that they should have been according to the Fair Wage Act, and they had to go back and fix that.
My final question, and that is, and perhaps you can just clarify again, your promise that this isn't going to happen again. What steps have you taken to ensure this is not going to happen with yet another subcontractor? Considering that everything was posted, it sounds as if you reminded staff, you reminded the subcontractors, and yet it happened. What are you doing to ensure this doesn't happen again?
Obviously, this is a huge issue for us, and it's an issue that we've been struggling with for a couple of years, that we've known that the city was contemplating this action. So we've sort of resigned ourselves to the fact that we were probably getting banned, because we were told you should have done this and you should have known and prove it to us otherwise, and we couldn't. We were just stuck. We couldn't meet city staff's requests for these audits. We couldn't do it. So we assumed that we would be here today at some point being told that we were banned. And I just wanted the opportunity to plead my case to you, to tell you that this is not good for the city and that this process needs to be tweaked in order to help, people like us that want to ensure that your policies are being met. If we get another opportunity, definitely won't be using those subcontractors. I can assure you of that. They won't be working for us anymore after the position that they've put us in. And again, all we can do really is to provide the information, is to notify the contractors, include it in the contracts, advertise the plan at the place of work, ensure the contractors know. We might actually put it in the correspondence, never mind that it's in the contract, but in the letter that we send you with your contract saying, you have to sign it, return it to us, these are the requirements, and we expect you to be in compliance with the fair wage. If you do something in arrears, you will be punished. But that's a function of the process here. Any of these trades could try. You can try it. You could try to move 2 workers in and hope that they only work for a week and not pay them and hope they get out, and it doesn't happen. It's very difficult for us because we don't ask each worker that comes in, can we see your pay stub? That's not how this works. And that's why it's such a challenge to manage this from our perspective.
What I'm hearing, though, is that you haven't put any changes in place yet?
Well, we have in the sense that we've notified every trade. We haven't had a new project since we've had these issues at Waterdown and Westmount. So we haven't been able to go out again and start at the beginning. At those projects, when we were notified of them, we immediately sent out a letter to every company reminding them. And we reposted the Fair Wage Act, and we did a toolbox talk, which, every worker's on site. You do a 10-minute safety talk in the mornings. So we designated for one day on the sites a safety talk about the fair wage policy. So that was all we could do at the ongoing projects. We haven't had a chance to make this more of a priority. If you give us the opportunity to continue bidding, we will make this a huge priority in the beginning of the projects and before we provide contracts, because obviously just writing it in the contract was not good enough, and that we have to make sure that these companies understand their obligations.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scully. I don't see indications for any further questions for Mr. Aquino. Thank you so much for your time today, sir. Thank you. Moved to receive by Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor of receipt? Thank you. And I believe we need to speak of 8.3 more broadly. Councillor Ferguson.
Well, first of all, if I can, through you to staff, and stop me if we need to go in camera on any of this, because I understand that. We mentioned that it was mentioned by the presenter that the subcontractors were found to be paying clack rates. And I recall during the latest round of negotiations where clack was at the table with the other unions, that there was a consensus on a rate that would fit them all. This is the base rate. The fair wage schedule doesn't include pension cost, anything else that's negotiated with the other unions. Am I correct in that through you, I guess, to Rick, that the clack was at the table and the clack rate meets the fair wage rate that's in our contracts? Okay, so if these subcontractors were signatory to clack, they violated their collective agreement then, in addition to violating the conditions of our contract.
I would guess that would be the case. I can't say whether they are associated with clack or not.
Okay, my second question is, it's alleged that the violations were all subcontractors. Is that correct? It was no employees of Bondfield that didn't meet the fair wage schedule?
That's correct. All the violations were subcontractors. One of them, I believe, was a subcontractor.
Sub, so like an excavator for electrical contract or something like that?
Chair, I believe on the one contract it had to do with electrical workers, and that work had been subbed and maybe even resubbed again. And in the end, the 5 employees who were indicated initially that they were independent contractors. And when we investigated it, and auditor was told that they were independent contractors, and he came back and told us. We got back to the complainant and said they were independent contractors, fair wage rates high in that case. And then after doing a little bit back and forth and some additional information, we met and we started looking into independent contractors. They'd been set up as independent contractors, but effectively they were covered by benefit plans that subcontractor offered to his employees, and his subtrades were covered under some of those things. So when we met with Mr. Aquino and the sub on that particular one, it was agreed that they were non-compliant and that in fact they were going to have to pay him substantially more money because, as I recall, hourly rates was, I think it was correctly, and they were substantially less.
Okay, I'll reserve any comments until after I hear from everybody else.
Thank you. Councillor Collins and then Councillor Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, and through you to Rick. Rick, I've been on the committee a number of years now, and this doesn't come up often in terms of the circumstances that are in front of us. How are other companies guarding against the same, in your opinion? And you've been involved with this for some time as well.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just a brief recap. Over the last few years, we've had 21 complaints registered. Of those, that was against 16 companies. Of that, 10 were found to be non-compliant. Bondfield is the only one that's ever had a second, or in this case, third instance of being non-compliant. The other ones it would appear, because they've had additional work since then, have done something to rectify the situation. I should point out that we met with Mr. Aquino and Bondfield on each and every issue after we did the investigation, and we talked about remedies that could be put in place. We talked about reserving within his contracts with subs the right to access their payroll records for review. Under the fair wage policy, it's required, I believe, that the contractor and subcontractor, I believe, are required to keep a detailed list of all employees that worked on the city contract, what they did, what the rate of pay they were paid. So that would facilitate any audit being done. When they came in, they would ask for that list. Then they go review the payroll records of those employees. If Bondfield did not reserve those rights for the audit to be done with their subcontractor, then they'd run into the kind of problem Mr. Aquino talked about potentially, that the subcontractor would say, I'm not opening up my records to you. We met, like I said, all 3 times. We talked about various solutions. Mr. Aquino that he was wanting to rectify these, and he said he'd go back and put those things in place. We asked for copies of anything that he had in writing with his subcontractor up front before the contract was awarded, indicating in detail the requirements of the fair wage policy and keeping the list of the employees and rates that the subcontractor would sign saying, I agree, I will abide by those requirements. And we were not provided anything from Mr. Aquino and Bondfield that would demonstrate that. We were provided a copy of a contract with one of the non-compliant firms being Avon Electric, and in it there's an Appendix A2, and it says it's a very brief appendix, and it talks about that it's included but not limited to, and it says fair wage policy. And that's all it says in that Appendix A2 under the fair wage policy. So if there's other additional information that would indicate that something in writing of a contractual nature, we weren't provided it. And on the records that we did get from Bondfield to show that the employees had been subsequently paid the right amounts, and we had to chase those up. We didn't get them as the original agreed upon timetable to get them. We had to follow up several times to get those records so that we could come close our files. And it's the same thing with paying the audit fees that are required if a firm is found to be non-compliant.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chairman, that process happened for every complaint that's listed in the report. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Johnson.
Rick, and this is just for my own information. When you had the 10 complaints over the last year, as you said, there were, and most times it was subcontractors that were being employed, and they were found not in compliance. Do we red flag those subcontractors just for our own information?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the last fair wage policy that committee and council just approved earlier this year, it imposes penalties on subcontractors for being found non-compliant in regards to banning, in regards to auditor report requirements and such. And going forward, any subcontractors found to be non-compliant will be placed on the list, and they will ultimately be banned from doing work if they're found, like on a second, third occasion, non-compliant with the fair wage policy.
So through you, Chair, to Rick, even though our contract is with the general contractor, we still have that added layer for the subcontractors.
Going forward, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. I just lost my other. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Next on my list is Councillor Skelly and then Councillor Pearson.
Thank you. Through the chair, Rick, how many other companies have been banned in the city of Hamilton?
I don't have that information with me today. There's several companies banned. I can provide it to members of committee. This is, I believe, the first one to be banned under the fair wage policy.
Through the chair, are the subcontractors involved in these non-compliance issues also banned?
Going forward, they would be banned on the policy that these were investigated under, which was at least one policy ago, possibly 2 policies ago. The provisions to ban the sub were not part of that fair wage policy. We didn't have that.
Chair, I'd like to clarify the timeline. At what point did you point out to Bondfield that the subcontractors were non-compliant, were not paying the right amount of money, and was it while the projects were still under construction, and if so, what was done to address that? Did they do enough in your estimation to perhaps make them more compliant, and or was there some neglect and perhaps pushback on their part to not comply?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the complaints were received, and they typically are received towards the end of a project. As soon as we received a complaint, we notify the contractor, in this case Bondfield, that we had received a complaint and what the nature of the complaint was, whether it was against their company in particular or whether it was against a sub, and that was done in this particular case. And then we asked them to touch base with their subcontractor and pave the way for our auditors to go in there to review the records, in which case Bondfield asked us to contact several times the subcontractor directly, and we had no problem doing that. And in a couple of instances, we had a reluctance from subcontractors, so we asked Bondfield to help us out with that, and they did. When we received the audit results, we called Bondfield in, we sat down, we went through them, and showed them what the findings were, who was underpaid and by how much money, and told them that we were going to be invoicing them for the cost of the audit as per the policy, and that we required proof, and we outlined what kind of proof we were required, that in fact the amounts were subsequently paid to employees, and they weren't paid under duress, because that was one of the concerns of the Fair Wage Committee and the various unions involved in that committee, that a contractor could conceivably pay his employees and then turn around and say, you need to give me a personal check to repay that back to us. So we've put in whatever safeguards we can to make sure that that's not likely to happen. So that's basically what the process and timing is.
Through the chair, it sounds as if they did what they could within a timely manner, and we're not trying to delay or prevent you from getting and addressing this issue and rectifying the problem.
Through you, Mr. Chair, they ensured that the subcontractor paid the deficiency in wages. They were not quick to comply with the requirements for the documentation that things had been paid or to pay the outstanding audit fee that was required. What they did not do was they did not provide the auditor's reports on the 3 contracts. And I should point out that the contracts were selected by Mr. Aquino personally, that he would like us to impose the requirement for the audit reports on those 3 contracts, including Waterdown. It was his choice. He said that those are 3 contracts I have on the go now. I'd like to get these audit reports out of the way. Would you consider taking 2 contracts I presently have and making those ones subject to an auditor's report. And we said, okay, we'll accommodate you in that regards. And the next contract that came up, that audit requirement was added to that as the third contract. Our fair wage policy is pretty well word for word identical with all the other municipalities that have fair wage policies, with the exception of Toronto, because Toronto has a massive office that does fair wage, and they do compliances for all the union agreements. They are a signatory to make sure that they review all the subs and sub-trades and contractors to make sure that they're compliant with whatever signatory requirements Toronto is faced with. We don't have that kind of manpower to do that. So our contract is identical, and it does all these contracts. I pulled them all off Friday and reviewed them, and they all have in there that on second or subsequent non-compliances that they would be requiring the contractor to submit an audit report on on 3 contracts, including all the subs, to make sure that they were compliant with the fair wage policy, which is exactly what we did in this case.
And you're suggesting then that they weren't as forthcoming with information for the audit as they should and could have been?
You, Mr. Chair, that's one of the issues. I have seen no willingness on their part to change their processes to ensure that there are tighter safeguards that the subcontractors will comply with the requirements of the fair wage policy. We suggested putting those written agreements in place up front that are signed by the subcontractor, saying he agrees to abide by all those details. He agrees to provide access to the records, all those requirements that need to be in place. What we got back from, we talked to the auditor, Deloitte, and we got the email back from Mr. Aquino saying he basically stopped the audit review, and it was onerous. Our fair wage policy was unfair. It wasn't in keeping with fair wage policies in other municipalities, and that basically he wasn't going to provide it because it was onerous, and he would be lobbying with the OGCA and other organizations to try and get our policy made fair and more equitable and less onerous, and that he realized that by doing so he could be facing a ban for not complying with the directive of the manager of procurement to provide the audit reports. And that's where we...
Thank you very much. Next on my list, Councillor Pearson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you to Mr. Mayle. Rick, just a couple of my questions have been answered, but I just want to ask, you said the policy has been changed. It was changed now to incorporate the sub-trades. When was that? When did we approve that change?
I believe it was at this committee March 9th.
Earlier this year. So if that were the case and that was in place before, the sub-trades would now have to, they would know they'd have to meet the requirements going forward that they do now, correct? So he would, Mr. Aquino would not have been in this situation if that policy had been changed earlier.
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, he'd still be in this situation. He would have been required to provide audit reports to us on the subs in those particular cases. But if we didn't have the audit reports and the sub was found to be non-compliant, the sub would also face being banned potentially. Bondfield itself would still be under the requirement to provide the proper documentation. Failure to do so would put them in a situation.
And what happens now with the sub-trades that are on these particular contracts? Because our policy only changed in March, we can't say we can't put them on the list that we don't deal with them. Is that correct?
Correct.
So Mr. Aquino is in the same situation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, Councillor Collins.
I would be prepared to move the recommendations as put in the staff report.
Thank you. Just before we consider that, Councillor Ferguson, do you have final questions?
Yeah, final question is to you, to Rick. Rick, how did you pick 10 years? It seems to me with some others, now they weren't fair wage schedule, you're right, this is the first fair wage one I can remember. There was poor performance, and they were in the order of 2 years. How did you pick 10? Is that in the schedule, the fair wage schedule?
Through you, Mr. Chair, under the procurement policies, ban could be for up to 10 years. Fair wage policy itself is two years. had we have sensed that Bondfield was totally cooperating with us, had agreed to make the changes suggested going forward, and they were basically done that in the past, which they said they were going to do, and the sub had just turned around and totally violated and whatever, probably wouldn't be looking at the 10-year ban, but we haven't operation and working with us to make sure that the fair wage policy is complied with by Bondfield's subtrades.
Okay, so under our policy, the ban term is a subjective thing depending on the severity then.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. You may require that the city center, we brought forward a report. I think we were recommending a ban of 2 years, and council upped that to, I believe, 10 years on that. Under number 4 in the policy, it says that if the vendor's refusal to follow reasonable directions of the city or to cure a default under any contract with the city as and when required by the city. And we've had the refusal to provide the audit reports, which was a clear Bondfield on the 3 contracts, and they've said they're not going to provide them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Collins proposed that we have a motion to accept the recommendation in our staff report. He has moved that. Is there a seconder for that motion? Am I saying the wrong thing, or? Nope. So I would be happy to second that motion. That's in keeping with our rules, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Clerk.
I'd prefer if it would be a member, but
Is there another councillor happy to second, or is there not? Seeing none, I offer myself a seconder, and the motion is on the floor. Discussion regarding this motion. Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, and I think my suggestion would be, and this is talking directly to the motion, that instead of 10 years, that it's 2 years per complaint, so that would make 6 years if you put them all together. 10 years to me is, and I understand where Rick's coming from with lack of cooperation, but if it's a 2-year policy, then can we just make it 6 years, which is 2 years per project complaint?
So that is a proposed amendment, if I'm not mistaken, to the motion. Is there a seconder for this amendment? Councillor Skelly has seconded this amendment. Are there questions or comments related to the proposed amendment? Councillor Ferguson, hand up first, please.
Thank you, Rick. Rick, does this impair your ability to enforce our contracts in the future by not going the 10 years, or can you live with this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, it doesn't impact our ability to come before committee and council and recommend bans.
Thank you. I'll support that. I think it's a fair compromise. 10 years is a long time. So I'm prepared to support the amendment.
Councillor Collins on the amendment.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I can't support the amendment because I can't think of another circumstance where we would give somebody a 10-year ban other than a circumstance like this one. So we clearly heard multiple times from Mr. Mail, who has been supported by a team of others within their purchasing and finance area. The company that's at issue here today showed an unwillingness to cooperate. I think I heard that several times. An unwillingness to share the audit results. I heard that several times. This is a 3 strikes and you're out policy, so it didn't happen just once. It happened 3 times, and we have that information in front of us. And so there were also recommendations put by staff to the contractor to advise that because you've been through this once, we would recommend that you take these steps to guard yourself against this happening again. That didn't happen. On the second instance, and I think I asked Rick this question and he responded the affirmative, we did the same. To ensure this doesn't happen again, we would suggest you do the following with your subcontractors. That recommendation was obviously not followed by the contractor, and then it happened a 3rd time. So I'm not certain in terms of why we're allowing someone who's essentially thumbed their nose at the city's fair wage policy to receive any other penalty than the one that's in front of us. So I'm certain that if we had those who were involved in the fair wage policy in front of us, that they would be stating the same. They have come in the past to address council in terms of the violations that have occurred, in terms of improving our policy, and I'm not certain why we have this policy in place if in fact we're not going to follow it. So I can't support the recommendation, or sorry, the amendment. much prefer to go with the more appropriate penalty that's listed in it.
Thanks very much. Councillor Skelly, would you take the chair for one moment so I can make a brief comment? My comment is simply a reiteration of the argument that Councillor Collins offered. I don't take the councillors who are in favor of this amendment as being opposed to our fair wage policy. I think it's very possible to be pro the fair wage policy and to seek a compromise, and that's where I see the majority of the councillors coming from, if I'm not mistaken. So I see that and I respect that. However, I think that our fair wage policy matters a ton. And I think that this decision, if we choose to water down implementation of our policy, would stand to be a bad precedent and would send a bad message. I think we need to send out a message that we care profoundly about our fair wage policy, and we're not willing to create negative precedents. So for that reason, I will be joining Councillor Collins in opposing this amendment. And I will take back the chair, if I may. Further questions, comments regarding the proposed amendment? Otherwise, I will call the question on the amendment. So, all in favor of the amendment? That's Councillor Pearson and Councillor Ferguson, Councillor Vanderbeek, Councillor Johnson, Councillor Skelly. All opposed? Myself, Councillor Collins. That carries. The motion is now amended. Yes, so, Mr. Clerk, please do. So, we now have an amended motion on the floor. Further questions and comments regarding the amended motion? Councillor Skelly, please.
I do want to actually reiterate what you just said, and this is certainly not a rejection of the fair wage policy. I'm very much in support of it. My concern is that the people who actually, the 3 subcontractors, continue to work in the city of Hamilton because of the timeline provided. And I think that the compromise of 2 years per penalty or non-compliance is fair. But again, I would like to reiterate that this is in no way suggesting that we are not supportive of the fair wage policy.
Thank you. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I just want to, again, offer reasons why I support the amendment, because the fair wage schedule calls for a 2-year ban, and because it's 3, that's 6. But more importantly, we need competition. Start eliminating contractors, and the largest one, I think there needs to be a message sent that we're not going to tolerate the piece of our fair wage schedule, because it's to make sure we don't have sweatshops on our projects, and we want to make sure work on those projects are fairly paged. I think there is something that's worse than banning the fair wage schedule. That's having a reckless, careless safety record. But I think 6 years sends a pretty clear message out there, and in 6 years, I'll support the motion as amended.
Thank you. Councillor Collins?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to reiterate, we can point the finger at someone else, but let's be clear, the general contractor is responsible for all the subs. So if the subs aren't following the law, the general's not following the law. And so, to try to deflect it, to justify the 6 years, I think is wrong.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions, so I believe it's time to vote on the amended motion. All in favor of the amended motion? Thank you very much. All opposed? Truthfully, if I could hand the chair over for one quick second, Councillor Skelly. The truth is, I see a good argument for voting for the amended motion. It's not the most terrible watering down in the history of time, but pursuant to my earlier remarks, I will vote with Councillor Collins, and if that could be recorded. Thanks. I keep turning off my microphone for no good reason. So that dispenses with 8.3. 8.4, revised report of the 2015 remuneration and expenses as required under Section 284 of the Municipal Act. Are there questions or discussion with respect to item 8.4? Moved by Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor. 8.5, one that I quite like, Sobey Hamilton Bike Share Employee Discount Pilot Project. Are there questions or discussion with respect to item 8.5? Seeing none. Councillor Vanderbeek and Councillor Pearson, all in favor. Oh, pardon me. Yes, Councillor Collins.
So after the 2 years, what do we expect or anticipate in terms of where this would go after it's offered to? What's the medium and long-term plan?
Oh, through the chair, Dave Lindeman, Health, Safety, Wellness. So our anticipation is after 2 years, and if we evaluate the program to continue it, much the same way that we continue the employee transit pass, So if it's meeting our objectives around the employees are actually using the bikes, they're using it to commute to work, that it's meeting our objectives around physical activity and promotion of physical activity, it's meeting our needs under the transportation master plan, that we're improving air quality, reducing congestion, promoting sustainable transportation, those kind of questions that we would come back to council and recommend continue.
But thank you for that. Would we anticipate offering it to all employees then?
Depending on the budget that we would have to set aside to it. So we'll see whether the 500 per year, the take up of that is. If we, reach that fairly quickly, then we may look at expanding it. If not, it may be, limited going forward. But cross that bridge when we get to the end of the 2 years.
So, Councillor Vanderbeek, Councillor Pearson, all in favor? Thank you. 8.6, Governance Review Subcommittee Report 16-002 dated May 2 of 2016. Are there questions or discussion with respect to 8.6? Mr. Clerk.
Through the chair, I apologize if that was not distributed, but I will do that now.
Perhaps it's the will of committee to consider this at a future committee meeting so we have time to read.
Was distributed, but
So I'm aware of 8.6. Is there a similar comfort level? Very good. So Councillor Johnson and Councillor Pearson and before we go to the motion, Councillor Johnson would like to offer a
I did
comment?
receive this in the mailbox first thing this morning, so I did have a chance to look at it, and I'll second the motion.
Thank you. So seconded by Councillor Pearson, all in favor? Oh, Councillor Ferguson, I apologize.
I have
Please
not
go
seen
ahead.
this before. I'm glancing over real fast, and I may have a conflict in this. So to be safe, I think I'll just declare it.
All right. So, Deanie, I'm not sure you caught that. Councillor Ferguson is declaring conflict of interest, so it's to be on the safe side. Declaration of interest, potential. And he will not be voting on this matter.
On two.
So, Councillor Johnson and Councillor Pearson.
Yep.
All in favor?
Carried.
Thank you, everybody. At motions. Water and wastewater storm extraordinary circumstances bill adjustment policy, RE 63, Durham Road and Stony Creek. Councillor Pearson, could you please introduce your motion?
I can, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. It's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Lloyd Ferguson. It's water and wastewater storm extraordinary circumstance bill adjustment policy for 63 Durham Road, Stony Creek, and that the July 2015 water and wastewater storm billing for 63 Durham Road, Stony Creek be deemed eligible under the water and wastewater storm extraordinary circumstance bill adjustment policy, and staff be directed to adjust the account as per the approved policy. And if I could just speak to it. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And if committee members recall, at the last committee meeting, we were dealing with this policy that was just implemented at last AFNA and ratified at the last council meeting. And I did discuss at that time and spoke to staff and mentioned that I had a concern with a resident in my ward back in 2015, summer last year, that had this particular situation. This policy could assist them, so that is why I'm bringing this forward now. Thank you.
Thanks. And pardon me, I neglected to ask your seconder.
My seconder was Councillor Lloyd Ferguson. Thank you.
Very good. So the motion is on the floor and seconded. Any discussion or questions? All in favor? Carried. Great. Are there any notices of motion? Seeing none. No general info. Private and confidential is citizen appointments to our volunteer advisory committees. Are there any questions with discussion? Any questions or discussion? If there are, closed session. But there are none. So Councillor Johnson is moving it. Councillor Skelly is seconding. May I please have a motion to approve 12.1? That is carried. May I please have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Skelly, Councillor Pearson, all in favor. See you next time, and thank you.